Right. Yeah, so thank you so much for being here. Before we start the session, I just want to make sure that we all know the rules of this space, that there are some codes of conduct, which are that we respect each other's experiences, identities, everything, the sort of discussions that we have here, we respect all of that. Along with that, we also keep any information that is shared here anonymous, and we do not go outside and share it, share personal details of anyone that expresses any particular information about them. um, yeah, so those are the basic rules, and we can probably begin. We have Rupsa here. Rupsa is hi, hi Rupsa. Yeah. Rupsa is the director of programs and innovations in Korea, and Rupsa is responsible for developing and implementing Korea's strategic initiatives and programs in India, South Asia region, and at the global level. For over a decade and a half, Rupsa has been engaging in advocating for sexual and reproductive health and abortion. Is that good? Rupsa?
That's perfect. Thank you, Pragya.
Great, great. So should I? Do you want to take over the session? Right?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you so
Okay.
much. And hello, everyone. Uh, and I'm really delighted to join you all for this session. And I hope we can have an interesting discussion. I do hope to keep it interactive so that I've broken down the session into three parts. Um, so, really, to start off first with really looking at this issue of abortion and communication, both in terms of textual or words and the way we talk about the issue as well as some of the visual representation. And I know from Pragya that you already have had an opportunity to view these two videos that were shared by them. So already are beginning to get a sense, I imagine, of some of the issues that one encounters when one is trying to message or communicate on the issue of abortion. Um, Once we do that, I'll do a quick input, and then hopefully we can have some discussions, questions, and honestly, no question is a wrong question. It's really a safe, non-judgmental space. So feel free to ask anything that's on your mind, any confusion. Please don't hesitate really to engage with this. We've all learned this, work on this issue. None of us have, and it continues to be. I would say, even for me, who's been working on this issue pretty much for the last almost 20 plus years. Yeah, I'm that old. Is that continues to present, a complex and profound challenge. So really, like I'm saying, there's no right or wrong question or answer, and hopefully we can engage. Once we do this first segment, roughly about 30 minutes, I'll do an input for about 15 minutes. We'll move into a Q&A discussion. I also thought I'll touch upon a segment on abortion and myths, because as you know, again, and maybe a little bit from even the film, I think particularly the one on stigma, that a lot of the stigma that one sees on this issue is built on this back of various kinds of myths. And as was rightly pointed out in the video, those myths could take various aspects. It could be around the procedure itself and what abortion is as a service. It could be definitely misunderstandings around what the law allows or disallows. And of course, we know it's a whole social context within which abortion stigma plays out. So I thought that would be helpful. And partly, I think, to reinforce the message that when we think as individuals or any of us who are advocates and want to work on this issue, it's very, very important that we kind of understand and appreciate a sort of an evidence based understanding. So, really inform ourselves, educate ourselves, and not just, let's say, for abortion, it's really interesting because, anybody who wants to work on the issue, we must understand the law well. Secondly, we must try to, because most of us are not doctors, right? So sometimes we think, oh, what do we need to know about the procedure or the medical kind of context, right? But it is a medical service and an essential medical service. So really to inform ourselves, because unless we do that, these myths get perpetuated, and we often kind of are not doing a good enough job of debunking those myths. And then you see how that plays out, let's say in the communication arena, plays out, in terms of reinforcing stigma, etc. So that's why I thought, let's, go through maybe a segment on looking at myths and on these various domains. Of course, none of this is going to be, fully comprehensive. I'm going to actually draw on a toolkit that Kriya has been actually partnering with Common Health, and we've been implementing a program on improving access to safe abortion in India, which includes an Abortion Gender and Rights Institute, bunch of other work with the alumni and participants of the institute, advocacy on legal reform. But in doing the institutes, we realized we had created a lot of material, So we decided to convert it into a toolkit. So I'm going to actually be using the toolkit. So you'll get a chance to see the toolkit modules. It's modular, so there are 10 modules, and I'll be sure to send a link to Pragya so you can, of course, have access to it and use it. We try to make it accessible and visually interesting, just to kind of make it easy for anyone who wants to work on this issue to be able to use it, in their work, in their advocacy, in whatever you choose to do. And then finally, I thought I'll do a little bit about really then zeroing in on media representation and why within media it's been such a challenge to represent sort of a rights-based kind of a frame on abortion. And I drew on a couple of research studies. So we'll end with that. And hopefully at various moments we will pause and have discussion. So it's a bit of a packed uh, session, but I hope that you will find it interesting. So I'm going to use screen share. And at any point, if you all have any questions or any confusion, please do raise hand or put it in chat. And Pragya, because I'm doing screen share, you'll keep an eye on the raise hand and chat. Just alert me. I mean, I really mean for this to be a fairly informal session. So really, I mean, let's don't hesitate. In other words, to interrupt or ask questions in between. So, like I said, this is actually this a toolkit we've developed with Common Health. It's called About the Stigma, and we focused on various aspects of what it would mean for anybody who wanted to understand this issue better, to get a sense of what. So, one, of course, an important component of the toolkit is this module on abortion and communication, and you'll see why, because it's a and for sure, I think already what is clear from the video that you watched on messaging, that language and words have played a huge role in the way that stigma is perpetuated, how we are able to talk about issues of choice and rights. And of course, I think with abortion, the issue is also that it is, in a way, a contested terrain, right? When we work on it, it's not that we who believe in abortion rights are doing the advocacy. There is a very fierce opposition, right, to this issue. So at every moment, therefore, the way we talk and represent on this issue, and if we do it inappropriately, becomes fodder for the opposition, people who oppose, access to safe abortion, decriminalization of abortion. So in the case of abortion, actually, it's really, really very, very important that we educate ourselves so that we're not feeding that kind of anti-abortion rhetoric. So this is something I think we continually, work on and try to kind of think through. So what this module does is really unpack some of the ways that abortion is often talked about. So for example, often you'll hear this word, and it's very commonly used. You'll find it even being used by people who work on sexual and reproductive health and rights. Is this thing of saying abortion is illegal, and we often discourage people from saying that, because the truth is, other than maybe two countries in the world, abortion is not illegal in the sense of completely banned. Usually, abortion is always kind of mediated through laws, as you might have already learned about in this program that you're doing. And often, if you've done that, you know that often these laws, they usually some grounds on which abortions are legal. For example, the right to life, the right to health, including mental health, you know, pregnancies due to rape and incest, often on the grounds of fetal anomalies, etc., etc. In India, for example, even failure of contraception is a ground. To kind of really be able to, when one is talking about, let's say, a country context where you want to describe the legal situation, I think it's really good to be very specific instead of kind of And even in very restrictive settings where the law really doesn't permit it, other than to save the life of the pregnant person, or and on very limited grounds, always good to be specific versus using a very blanket term like saying abortion is illegal. Second, as you would have seen in the film, I'll go through a few of these terms and all of that, and then, maybe we can circle back to a discussion. Often you'll find, you'll hear very commonly people say abort a child, terminate a child. Like often, I think the term child and same way, often people will refer to a pregnant woman or a pregnant person as mother, and we do it very inadvertently because, for in most instances, of course, for every one abortion, there might be five pregnancies that, in fact, pregnant persons want to continue. And of course, the outcome of a pregnancy in those instances is a child, and the person does become a mother. But again, mother, we can think about why mother, increasingly there is a discussion and debate about is just using the word women and mother really inclusive, because we are looking at a much, much more diverse set of people who in fact have pregnancies, and some might want a abortion and some might want to become parents. So I think, often, in our, when we're talking about it, we tend, so I think it's really important that one thing, uses terms like terminate a pregnancy or have an abortion, because, the moment we start, and, the anti-choice campaigns and this kind of, they have continually tried to kind of use language in very powerful ways, and we sometimes feed into that when we use the same language, because the attempt has always been by the anti-choice advocates to convey this idea that the moment you become pregnant, the fetus already has personhood, feels pain. I mean, you see these graphic kind of ways that language is deployed, and this idea that already the fetus is a child, and it's deliberate, right, this conflation. And of course we know, and even if you're not thinking about these organized anti-choice movements, if you think about a community, and you saw that video on stigma, which is really excellent, that was shared, really how at a social level also, it's considered a sin, it's considered, attached to things like killing, to murder. And of course popular media, including films, have kind of reinforced that. And so when we as advocates or people who want to work on this issue from a rights-based lens, with this belief that bodily autonomy, choice are inherent rights of individuals who get pregnant, when we also start, sometimes being careless and using these terms, it's only adding to this kind of a negative connotation. Similarly, all of you, because you're based in India, you know that in the last 2 or 3 decades, sex selection has been such a like a parallel yet conflated issue, which we've had to deal with when we've had to kind of work on the issue of abortion. It's created, it's deepened stigma. It's created a lot of like barriers in the way we are able to advocate for improved access to safe abortion, and often in the whole sex selection kind of discussions, advocacy, which, by the way, has also been the more visible one. Abortion advocacy has been much less visible, whereas the issue of sex selection has been common. And till date, you'll find advocates, including women's rights advocates, who talk about things like female feticide, gendercide, aborting girls. So this kind of this idea of killing, which is used in the context of sex selection, but because often sex selection, the tendency has been not to look at the sociocultural norms that perpetuate, let's say, this gender bias, and that which translates into sex selection, but using this kind of language that links it to abortion, to feticide, has obviously created again another layer of complexity. So I think one needs to be really careful. So even if in the context of sex selection, when we're trying to talk about some of these issues, I think to be really careful how one talks about an abortion, which is an outcome of a detection of the sex of the fetus. So literally, to say ending a pregnancy based on the sex of the fetus versus female feticide. And of course, for sex selection, also, we've tended to use things like gender biased sex selection versus sex selective abortion. You'll find again, often we tend to link abortion, even in the way we talk about sex selection, when we start saying things like sex selective abortion. So I think particularly in the Indian context, very, very important to pay attention to this. Of course, again, this continued use of of terminology around killing an unborn child, or continuing a pregnancy, or keeping a child. This idea of keeping, you know, uh, which is these are just the ways we talk about it. So I think just important to keep those in mind. I think one other important thing to keep in mind is exactly, I mean, this uh, is that to remember that the fetus and its developmental, like, sort of the trajectory, and if you look up sort of the medical technical, that how is it an embryo, which is usually a fetus up to 10 weeks is described as an embryo. So this is really the early stages of pregnancy in the first trimester. First trimester goes up all the way up to 12 weeks, but really most abortions are really happening in those first 10 weeks. If you look up the data, for example, on incidence of abortion in India, you'll find majority of persons with unintended pregnancies tend to seek abortions early, and really at that time it's really an embryo. And then of course after 10 weeks, we tend to use the term fetus, and so I think to be really careful when we are using these when we're trying to talk about a pregnancy, to be really careful in using these terms, and these are scientifically, medically, like, appropriate terms versus baby and unborn child, etc., because certainly it's not a baby. And across the world, including in most countries other than a few countries, really, I mean, human rights, if you're thinking about rights, really accrues after birth. So you are considered a human being post birth. But the attempt of the anti-choice movement has been to kind of attribute this thing of right to life to the fetus. And in fact, there are some countries that have in fact changed their constitutions to grant fetus the same kind of rights as someone post birth. But by and large, human rights standard setting has not is really only at birth. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind. um, I think the other thing often we tend to do, and this is a very famous saying, and I'm forgetting who said it. It's this thing about making abortion safe, legal, and rare. This idea that you need to reduce or prevent abortions uh, is a very common trope, and often deployed even by women's rights advocates, etc. To kind of, like, not, kind of the fine balancing act where you are kind of saying, oh, I'm not anti-choice, but I'm not fully committed to this right as an unqualified right. So, really, let's make it safe and legal, but really let's try and reduce the number of abortions. That makes no sense at all. Because the thing is, the abortion is an outcome of an unintended pregnancy or an unwanted pregnancy, and that could be for various reasons. If a pregnancy is a result of some form of sexual violence, it could be that the person chooses not to continue the pregnancy. So definitely an unwanted pregnancy. Unintended could be that I don't have access to contraception or not able to use it in a effective way. And so even though I might want a child, at this point I don't want. So unintended. So I think often we need to really understand the reason why an abortion is needed. Uh, and versus kind of this idea that if we, that our work needs to be about reducing abortions, our work needs to be about reducing unintended and unwanted pregnancies, and addressing those issues of gender, sexuality, autonomy, etc., that we're, any individual and particularly women face in control, in having that control over their sexuality and reproductive and sexual health. That often then translates into a pregnancy that is either unwanted or unintended. So I think, again, you'll find this a very commonly used kind of phraseology, that one, the other thing you'll find, and I alluded to a bit this in the beginning, this thing of illegal abortion. The other thing you'll find often is, it's a lot of us, it's very common. This thing of interchangeably using this thing of idea of illegal abortion, but equal to unsafe abortion. So kind of interchangeably, when you want to talk about unsafe abortion, you tend to equate it with illegal abortion. Or when you talk about illegal abortion, you equate it with unsafe abortion. But they're two distinct things, and we must be very, very careful in how we use the term. So, for example, if you're trying to talk about, let's say, a country context, let's take India, for example, abortion is legal on certain grounds. And that includes the fact, for example, that the providers or doctors who are providing abortions, or let's say the facility where one is seeking abortions, needs to be registered. If they are not registered, even though it might be a trained doctor, and somebody seeks an abortion there, then that abortion can be legal in terms of the law. It need not be unsafe. It could be that this provider is actually trained and has just not been able to go through the red tape that's always involved in getting these registrations done to get the clinic registered. So illegal abortions are about the violations of the law, but they need not always be unsafe. I'm not saying for a minute that they're all safe, but what I'm trying to say is we need to make that distinction. On the other hand, unsafe abortions could be in a registered facility. So this could be a provider who kind of has registered the facility, has got a registration, but is not trained well enough to provide a safe abortion. So you could be in a completely legal setting and yet having an unsafe abortion. And this has often been the case, in fact, interestingly, in public health facilities, where firstly access is very limited, and often doctors are not trained enough or are undertrained, and so you could end up having an unsafe abortion in a completely legal facility. So I think this is again something very important to keep in mind, and if you're going to work on this issue, talk about this issue, to make this distinction. And then I was also just a bit earlier talking about this thing of unwanted and unplanned or unintended. These are again two distinct things, and again, we tend to use them interchangeably. And so it's important, again, we keep in mind unwanted, as I said earlier, is something that this person just does not want. It's not a wanted pregnancy, and therefore termination needed. And unplanned or unintended, again, like I gave the example, could be simply a question of timing, a question of not wanting the pregnancy to occur at a certain point, but the person could well be wanting to have a pregnancy later, you know. So it could be both a wanted or an unwanted pregnancy. So again, I think an unintended pregnancy need not always be an unwanted pregnancy. Actually, there's also been a big debate, and I personally rarely use unwanted because I feel it kind of puts forth a bit of a pejorative, negative meaning. In my view, I would be even comfortable if we just talked about unplanned and unintended. In fact, that's the kind of language I use. I don't personally like to use unwanted pregnancy, but I just wanted to put it out there to just kind of again kind of emphasize that these words seem so similar that one almost tends to feel, okay, I can use this in one sentence and then the other word in the other sentence, but actually they connote very different meanings. And all of this together, of course, as you can see, is contributing to a certain kind of a messaging, a certain kind of a view on the issue of abortion, which is adding to the stigma, and it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle, right? And so I think very, very important that we continue to pay attention. So that's a bit about words. Wanted to turn a bit to visuals and the way abortion is represented visually. And I have to say, and I keep thinking about this. In fact, Pragya, it's probably a pitch to you all. I keep thinking we should launch some kind of a competition or fellowship and get really creative people to create a whole new sort of, there are all these stock photos that keep regularly getting used in media and all. And honestly, the way the visual representation of abortion has just been so pathetic and appalling. And I'll touch on that a bit when I come to the section on how in media we represent some of these issues. But we're going to go through some of that here. But just like the way, even an article that might be talking about it positively, or let's say even a publication. Often I find even research studies, when they're doing a cover for publication, you'll find like images of pregnant women, that too like really visibly pregnant women. And you'll remember just now I talked about how often abortions are happening at a really early stage of pregnancy, when the fetus is at an embryo stage, or like the early stage of gestation. Really no baby bump shows, if you all have had family members, people you know, or have yourselves gone through a pregnancy, you will know that that's not the case. But when we're doing a publication on this issue, these images of these visibly pregnant women, whereas one could, for example, use something quite gender neutral. For one, could be not about the person. I mean, I personally don't like like, I feel like some of these issues, it's almost safer not to use visuals related to people, not least, I mean, certainly not real people, because I always wonder about issues of confidentiality and privacy, knowing how stigmatized it is. So I often wonder when pictures of actual persons who are pregnant is put on covers of publication, like what has been this process of consent taken. But even if it's not an actual person, like a photograph, but like a visual, like a graphic depiction, I just feel we always go wrong. For one, we will just always maybe show somebody, like typically it'll always be a woman. Typically, the way the woman is constructed would always give a sense that it's somebody who's married, at least in some cases, married, long hair, the typical look of this married woman, versus somebody who might be unmarried, younger, etc. And again, you also saw a bit of that in the videos about how a certain kind of stereotype is created around this good abortion and bad abortion, linked to good woman and bad woman, a good person and bad person, right? And often our visuals can perpetuate that idea. So, for example, instead of using a visibly pregnant woman, why not show something like, even like a pregnancy test kit or something? I know it doesn't seem sexy and interesting sometimes, but like it's definitely a better, more robust way to message than showing women. Um, Often again, sorry, I did something. Just give me a second. I'll start screen share. Just give me a second. Sometimes I end up. Just give me a second. Sorry about that, people. Where did it go? One second. I just did something and it disappeared from my screen. I tell you, Zoom. Okay, here. Let me try. Is it showing now, folks? Yeah, all good. Um, uh, so again, obviously, like, even if one wanted to use pictures of women, of pregnant persons, I think always this attention to using more diverse depictions of women across age, across status, across, and therefore that's why using images of people always more complex, because how does one visually depict that diversity? Of course, there's really amazing creative stuff coming out. We ourselves experimented with every year we run the Support the Stigma campaign around 28th September, which is this International Day for Safe Abortion or something. I'm forgetting the exact term, but anyway, it's a day that's obviously used to talk on these issues. And so we've in the past tried to experiment with creating more diverse kind of visuals around diverse depictions of women, persons, etc. So I think that's something to keep in mind. So even if one is inclined to use images of persons, how does one depict diversity? Because you certainly don't want to leave this idea there's only certain kind of people who get abortions and certain kinds we don't represent. And of course, we know this because the more you kind of, especially in our work, in our reports, our publications, our campaigns, the more we reinforce this certain one kind of woman in the visual narrative, it's basically saying nobody else merits, right, in an inadvertent way. So, if never in our visuals we're showing young people, different kinds of people, it's almost like you're erasing this kind of idea that these are also people who might at various stages in their lives need an abortion for an unintended pregnancy. This is also thing of blurring faces. So if one is wanting to use a photograph, so whether it's video footage and all, it's always very very difficult, right, because it's so stigmatized to really use first person kind of images, narratives, visuals. But if one is going down that road and is really worked robustly on taking the right consent, privacy, ensuring the person doesn't face the consequences of going public, then this kind of this idea of blurring faces is like really undesirable, because you're really communicating, like the way media does, they'll blur the faces of these people who get arrested and are being taken. I mean, of course, one needs to respect privacy, but one is connoting this something we should be ashamed and guilty about. Whereas, we really need to push ourselves to say that there's nothing blurred and about this issue. It is not something that we need to be ashamed or guilty about. It's another medical service, completely legitimate, and therefore we can speak about this openly and represent it openly. But like I said, obviously, because of the deep rooted stigma, sometimes it becomes very challenging, and and that's where I feel, therefore, not to kind of even use people versus think of other creative ways to, Then similarly, if one is using images, then really to work towards using more neutral expression or expressions that are not denoting some kind of a negative or traumatic experience kind of an idea, which is again something one tends to see. So, really to show a kind of either a neutral expression or a more kind of and it's true, it's a very individual experience, right? The way I might experience an abortion, you won't. So not to homogenize the experience, there are of course people who might experience some sort of anxiety, etc. And often, sometimes the anxiety and even if people want to say the trauma is actually not linked to the actual procedure. It's often linked to this wider stigma and how one internalize it, right? We watched it in the video, how one is internalizing it, and therefore that shame and stigma is attached, and therefore your experience then becomes something which actually, for the most part, most pregnant persons who need and get an abortion feel relief, right? So I think really, again, if one is using images, to be very attentive to the way, the expressions, because that again, has a way of connoting a meaning. You will have seen, if you read newspapers or even social media representation, almost always, an article on abortion, whether it's something negative or positive, including very positive articles, suddenly there'll be a stock photo of a fetus, either a pregnant stomach, which will have like this X-ray image of this kind of fairly developed fetus, almost like a child, or just a fetus floating, I don't know where in space. Like one wonders where and how people even imagine these images make any sense, but very commonly used. And part of the reason you must remember, and if you ever choose to do this, like get onto the internet and you Google, the anti-choice movement has very successfully like created so much of this imagery, and it's there. So anybody who's wanting to publish, and imagine some newspaper editor who doesn't know much and they keep looking for stock photos, right? They'll go like a photographer in a newspaper office. So somebody has written the article, now they're doing the page layout and they need an image. They'll Google, and often always they'll chance upon all these kind of really negative representations of fetuses that are older, almost fully developed. And we know that often at that stage, after the kinds of fetuses they show are just medically inaccurate. Nobody is getting an abortion at that stage. But the moment you put a picture like that, and somebody who's thinking about this issue and is not fully clear if they support it or don't support it, they'll immediately make that immediate association. Oh my God, the baby that's getting aborted, right? So I think very, very important. And often, this tendency to use very graphic, explicit images, this you will say, this has been done a lot in the sex selection kind of advocacy and campaigns. This kind of image of this fetus with a knife going through, blood dripping, scissor cutting, really to kind of convey this idea of actually gender biased sex selection. But the most of the representation has been really kind of with the fetus as a very central piece in that representation. So again, if you choose to get onto Google and look for some of these documentaries, there are all these videos where the fetus is speaking, saying, I want to live and all. And so really, these kinds of graphic shock images has been a tactic, right, of the anti-choice advocates world over. And because, now Google and whatever has been the space where we're looking for these easy kinds of ways to find images, one ends up getting this. And if you don't know enough and inadvertently use it, then you're really feeding into that same kind of a discourse. So definitely, I think when one is thinking about working on this issue, and for sure you will need to use words and need to use visuals, really being very, very attentive to the language, to be able to really reflect. So I think uh, that's pretty much like what I wanted to communicate around this, because for sure language, I mean, we know this, that representation, particularly in the media or in social media, you know, reinforces, right, certain stigma that's already there on this issue. And therefore, any of us who choose to work on this issue, we really need to really inform ourselves on what is it, the language. And it's always been very challenging to kind of really craft messaging uh, both through words and visuals. Therefore, more and more you'll see a lot of online campaigns, but honestly, I feel like, and very quickly people tend to put things, messaging out. And sometimes the messaging could be positive, but the images that go with it end up being really negative, and really, therefore, ends up doing more harm than good. So I'll just stop there for a bit, Pragya, just in case people want to come in. If they have any examples of whatever you've come across on social media, your own personal experiences, really, please feel free to come in and share. So it doesn't even have to be a question, but really, I would love to hear your views, even. And maybe if you've already started working on this issue, written on this issue, what are some of the ways that you've encountered the way that language and images have been used? So I'll just stop there maybe and pause for a bit to see if people want to come in and engage with this.
Right. Yeah. So, are there any questions or any reflections or anything?
I just hi. So I was wondering. I mean, when you said share the experience, so as I think I've especially sort of struggled with the regional language specifically. So I've tried to do a few translations in general for like in my workspace. So the Hindi word for like miscarriage and for abortion is the same, like in even in popular. So I think things like that. I'm also wondering what kind of like resources or like is there some sort of way to navigate the regional sort of that? So yeah.
No, completely agree with you, Ananya, right? Uh, um, yeah, I mean, I think for us in India, really also, I think there's huge need for us to find ways to, create language, in Hindi and certainly in other local languages. You're right, a lot of the terminology, as we know, including with sexuality for that matter, is often got very pejorative connotations. So, for example, at Kriya, we tend to use Garb Samapan versus Garbhat, even though that's very commonly used. Or Bacha Girana, very common, right? And we go to the local level, there's a ton of things. But, so we've in our own way tried to come up with these kinds of languages, but then how does one really influence like community level discourse and language on this? But at a minimum, for sure, I think as people working on this issue, if you speak some other local language, really this work on creating a whole vocabulary in our local languages. And Kriya, certainly, I think in the last, and we've been around for 20 years, a big piece of our work has been on issues, on translations, on creating local language, mostly Hindi, on this issue. In fact, we had produced we used to for many years produce a Hindi edition of this journal called Sexual and Reproductive Health Matters. It used to be known as Reproductive Health Matters, and one of the issues was on this issue of abortion, and we had done a whole editorial on exactly this need for creating a more positive, rights-based kind of language on this issue. And then, of course, the second challenge of how do you then take it to the community level, because the words that are used more commonly are these kinds of words that have a very negative meaning. So I've just spent, 25 minutes talking about how not to use child, etc. But we know this, right? And forget in community settings, even within our households, if you're speaking in a local language, often we struggle to find the words because the vocabulary still remains quite limited in the local language. But there's been work that's been done. For sure, YP has done. So I think one interesting thing could be to really curate and create a glossary or create a one common space where many of us who are struggling to find vocabulary or language are able to access it easily. Because, in the last 10 years, I do think a lot of work has happened, particularly in Hindi. I'm not sure if it's happened in as much in other languages. That's the hegemony of Hindi. And I'm actually not a Hindi speaker, but I was thinking I'm a Bengali. I was trying to think in Bengali, like if that much work has happened. But we should certainly try to Yeah, I think it's a very, very important question and comment, Ananya. Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any other questions, reflections, anything?
Hi, so I'm Akriti, and yesterday I was just looking around the map that has been provided by the YP Foundation, which significantly tells that what countries are, has prohibited altogether abortions, and there are different scales. And like India, there are some other grounds for abortions. Some are very liberal countries. So I was just thinking, and I was particularly reading about Philippines and reading about their laws. Like, in the map that has been provided, it was written that it has been altogether prohibited. And I saw that over 20 countries has been mentioned there, that there are like around 20 countries that has prohibited. And when I was looking particularly to their law, they say that they will allow abortion if it is going to hamper a woman's life, but there is no such particular law to go with it. Like, I can't access that resource. So I'm not able to comprehend this, like this information. Like, it's very misused and misjudged. uh, so if you could just comment on that or highlight it.
For sure. And there are several Latin American countries, right? Women have been jailed. For example, Nepal, right here, our neighbor, till 2012, large percentages of women were in jail because they had sought an abortion. So it was completely criminalized, as you're saying. And not only is it disallowed, but there is actually criminalization. So if you go ahead and seek an abortion, could actually be put in jail. And that is the case in many, I think, El Salvador, we've been reading about a very important case. And these are even instances when these are very young people who've been raped, for example, end up with a pregnancy, then somebody's trying to help them get an abortion, and then if that comes out, this young person has been jailed. It's been a kind of a high profile. No, you're absolutely right. So I think extremely restrictive settings, and many of these countries like Philippines, of course, has been an active, it's a predominantly Catholic country, and for years, I think only recently they even gained approval to use contraception. Otherwise, even contraception was banned. Yeah. So and I think, yes, I mean, to the extent that this idea that the only instance you can get an abortion is to save a person's life, a woman's life, exists in most country contexts. But as you've also rightly pointed out, it's not clearly fleshed out that what constitutes this threat to life. So it's very much left to the discretion of providers. And often in many of these countries, providers, because we are operating in this socialized context, many of them are actually anti-choice. So they can be significant barriers. They will assess, and even if so it's literally like if you're going to die, they will provide and nothing else. So you're right. If there is no law, it's not clearly enumerated what constitutes this threat to life, it can create a very, very narrow window of what that interpretation is, which pretty much means most people are being denied. There's a very famous case in Ireland, right? You'll remember Savita Halpanar, which eventually resulted in the referendum in Ireland, which legalized or decriminalized abortion, where she had a pregnancy, she needed an abortion, it was denied to her and resulted in her death, because the assessment of the providers was that the fetal heartbeat could still be felt, even though the fetus for all purposes had become unviable. And it had caused septicemia in her body and all. I mean, it was a terrible instance. But, it of course created huge, widespread outrage, was covered in the media, and eventually resulted in this referendum after some years of that incident happening. But yeah, so just to say, yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it is a very challenging issue, which is why I think also when we work on this issue of improving access to safe abortion, definitely we need to pay very close attention to the law or to criminalization of abortion. It's not a very active discussion in India. Frankly, it's only in early stages of discussion because we've had an abortion law that kind of legalizes within a limited framework, and people feel, oh, kind of almost, so that's, the public health kind of piece of it seems to be stronger. So people are working on access, quality of care. But I personally really believe that's why it's so, so important to work on decrim, because that's really the site, because still abortion remains criminalized and you have this very limited window. I mean, imagine in 20 countries, you have to literally be dying to get this procedure, tells you that, and often, yeah, and most of them don't have laws. It's kind of in there, it's in the criminal codes. Even in India, we have it in our penal code. Abortion law is just an exception. So any of us could still be jailed or booked. Huh? So like this whole issue of if you were to induce an abortion, self-induce, and when the code was done, it's 100-year-old criminal code. But imagine now in a situation of medical abortion, tomorrow I go and buy a pill, and something were to happen. Or I mean, if somebody is malicious enough or wants to report it as a criminal procedure, as an illegal abortion under the Indian Penal Code, I could be jailed, as could thousands of women. So I think we certainly need to be more attentive to these issues of criminalization and how it plays out, and particularly in very restrictive settings where India, it needs to become a growing conversation. Should I just move on to the myth segment unless somebody wanted to come in? Yes, please do, Nidhi. Please do.
Hello, ma'am. Good evening.
Good evening.
It was really nice and insightful listening to you today. So I was going through the course structure, and I came then when I was looking at the legal aspects of the abortion, I came to know that there is this age bar of seeking accessing the abortion. I mean, people below the age of 18 years, which categorizes particularly the teenage, like entire of the teenage. So I feel that during our teenage, particularly from like 14 to 16, 17, 18 years, that is the time period when mostly the teenage, the sexual desires into teenagers quite high, and because of lack of proper education on dealing with concepts like abortion, sex, and other things because of the stigma. Uh, so that's when the abortion need is particularly higher, and we see like people mostly of that age category need abortion. But however, that's the most difficult time period when you can get the abortion. Like, what can be done, or like how can we tackle this thing of not restricting abortion to certain age categories?
So a couple of things. It's actually a very complex issue. I talked about sex selection, but the other thing is there's another law which you probably know about, POCSO, which is about preventing child sexual abuse. But that law has emerged as a very significant barrier in the way young people are able to access abortion. So I'll come to that a bit. But I think within the abortion law in India, the Medical Termination of Pregnancy Act, yes, below 18 years, a young person cannot give consent, but consent of a guardian, and guardian has been defined very broadly. It doesn't mean parent. It doesn't mean a family member in that sense. It could be just an adult, somebody, right? Could be a friend, could be a somebody who's an ally. And that's why I was saying that really important to go through these provisions of the law, because you can in fact create an enabling environment. It's true, below 18 years you can't provide consent yourself, but you can certainly, and often doctors and others, one needs to work a lot on sensitization of providers, because even for adult women, particularly married women, even though the person can individually give consent, routinely doctors ask for husband's consent. Huh? So this is not just about, and for young people similarly, where are the parents get consent, whereas actually by law you're not, it could be any adult person, could be an older sibling above 18 years who's accompanying and providing the consent. So I think that's important. But having said that, I think what's also emerged as a really, really critical barrier right now is because POCSO defines anybody below 18 as a child and really criminalizes all sexual activity, including consensual sexual activity. So where and has this provision to, if I come to know of a young person who's below 18 and has had sex, and even though I know that it's consensual, I have to mandatorily report it, and report it as a crime, as an abuse. And so oftentimes what happens is when somebody is going for sexual and reproductive health service in general as a young person, and particularly abortion, obviously, especially certain kind, if let's say you're going to the clinic to ask for contraception, you're going to ask, obviously, those needs connote that you're sexually active, correct? So the provider is going to make that interpretation that you've indulged in sex, therefore you're pregnant, therefore you've come for an abortion. And because the POCSO doesn't allow you to look at it in terms of has it been consensual, has it been with somebody with whom you consented to, and of course the young person didn't know how to protect yourself, ended up with a pregnancy, versus somebody who's faced abuse, right? And so this blanket requirement of mandatory reporting, even though the law also says that you should report, but you should also provide the service, I think it makes providers really nervous. Anything to do with the law, they're not able to assess. So they're like, jhanjat nahi chahiye, just like forget it, turn the person away. But yes, I agree with you. Between the abortion law that kind of requires consent of a guardian, broadly defined, POCSO, which has a certain kind of standard setting in place that's denying young people like control over their sexuality, etc. We are really faced with a very, very challenging environment within which young people are really able to kind of exercise their sexual autonomy. And for sure, if you choose to do it, then the law is creating all kinds of barriers for you to then access a sexual and reproductive health service, which often is a kind of a corollary of being, sexually active. I mean, of course, you need certain kinds of services and information and counseling. So yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, that's what it is. And Pragya, did you all cover some of these issues in some of the earlier sessions? You
Yes.
have. I'm sure you have. Yeah, yeah. Should we just move on to the next segment on myths, and then, unless anyone else has a question,
Or we
and
could take the questions maybe later. I don't know if someone had a question. You can also put them in the chat box.
yeah, and
This
I'll
is
be
only
sure.
this is only because we're not running out of time, but
Yeah,
we just
we
want to
are. We are going a bit
yeah,
slower than.
right. Go ahead, Rupsa.
The myths and misconceptions, I'll be sure to send this to you all via Pragya. So of course you can look at it closer. I might skim the second one a bit more. But as you can see, as I'm skimming through the thing, that there's all these modular things. So like I was saying, one is, of course, we've already touched upon this, is really a lot of myths around the law, which is like myths as in, if we don't understand the law well enough, then certain myths get perpetuated, or so one which we've touched upon already in this thing around communication is this idea that safe abortion equals to a legal abortion, and an illegal abortion equals to an unsafe abortion. So definitely something we need to think about. There's this whole business which I just mentioned, this thing of a woman, a married woman needing a husband's consent, absolutely not needed under the law. Literally, a woman can walk in and consent to that own thing, own abortion. But again, providers tend to insist on it sometimes. Huh? Then you have a whole bunch of medical myths, that it's dangerous, it has long-term health effects. And of course, if you look at the facts, the safest, simplest procedures, now with medical abortion, etc., it's almost like you could self-use or be guided through the process. You don't even need to go to a clinic. So I think, but this myth continues to be perpetuated, and so I think really informing ourselves on the science and the evidence on the medical aspects of it. Then the one I was talking about, right, which I alluded to, this idea that you must have safe and legal, but make it rare. Almost making it seem that if and often one of those arguments there is, oh, everybody has access to contraception, there would be no need for abortion, which of course is not true. We know contraceptives fail. We know, we could forget to take a contraceptive pill. So, never like this idea of let's make abortion rare, let's reduce abortions is part of this kind of one kind of way that people don't want to necessarily come across as anti-choice, but have this kind of uncomfortable relationship with abortion rights kind of take, and it's a dangerous one. Um, then there is a whole conflation of the emergency contraceptive pill and abortion, that people tend to conflate, including people within the SRHR field. So really important to be very, very careful about what an emergency contraceptive pill really does. It prevents a pregnancy, it does not terminate it. and then what abortion is. But again, you'll find it's a very common conflation that's happening. And then, of course, the whole bit around social, I think we've touched upon when we looked at the issue of words and visuals. But definitely, I think, linked to this question one of you had just now about young people and why there's so much resistance to sexuality education is this kind of trope around, oh, you give them information about sexuality and abortion, and they'll suddenly all turn promiscuous overnight and etc. Whereas we know from all the work we've done that that's completely the opposite, right? And but it's a very very common thing that you'll hear people say, oh, why are we giving them all this information, as if that would lead to greater. There's the other one in India, which we've dealt with a lot, and it's a very, very deep rooted thing because of this issue of sex selection. This idea that if you're getting abortions later in your pregnancy, so second trimester, that's after 12 weeks, that it's all sex selection. It's all because the sex of the fetus. Again, there's data to show that that's not the case, but but it's very commonly perpetuated, and particularly by people who are doing this work on sex selection. So again, it's been a real uh, it's become such a deep rooted myth that it's almost impossible to talk about abortion access in the later stages of pregnancy without always having to defend this kind of argument. Defend as in, defend our position versus these kinds of arguments. Like I said, this whole thing, which of course the visual representation to some extent has contributed to this idea that, yeah, I mean, of course I need an abortion, but I really regret it, and it's contributing to trauma and all of that. And like I said, there aren't studies done with women who've sought abortions, and most express relief, express the thing that it was the right decision for them at the right time. And think about it. I mean, what is unsafe abortion at the end of the day? It is that women or pregnant persons, irrespective of what their legal context is, in spite of it being really restricted and criminalized, still seek abortion. So I always say, if I want one, I will get it under whatever circumstances, even if it means that I might die because it will be an unsafe procedure. So that clearly tells you that when somebody concludes that this is an unwanted or unintended pregnancy and I want to terminate it, terminate we will. The only question being, will the countries that we live in create an enabling legal environment, an enabling health environment within which we can seek it safely? But women or anybody who's pregnant who needs it are definitely going to get it whichever way they can. And then, of course, this again the same thing which we touched upon, this idea of killing an unborn child, etc., is very much there in the so that's this. And I just wanted to also highlight that in the last years, certainly from the courts, for example, if you know of the right to privacy judgment, the 9-judge constitutional bench that gave us the right to privacy, there's expansive language today coming out of the courts that's talking about bodily autonomy, about rights, etc. And as advocates, I think we don't do a good enough job sometimes of using some of that progressive language coming out of our institutions. One thing for me to say, but how can we bolster our advocacy? So I would urge that, really to look at some of those judgments that have come out, the progressive judgments, as a way to bust some of these myths, whether it's about this idea that, oh, married women should never decide. After all, it's his child also. And this very common. You'll hear it in your own houses, I'm telling you. It's so common. But the courts have clearly said that this a pregnant person is an individual who's going through the pregnancy, and therefore it is entirely their right to decide because it is their body, right? So I think also how some of these myths we don't just counter, we put in some arguments here, but to cross-reference with judgments, with for example, on the medical ones, the WHO, and even India, for that matter, the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare has guidance, technical guidance, standard setting. So to the full extent possible, use those to reference. So when one is countering a myth, really to use more evidence-based kind of language to say, okay, this, and it's great if you can find Indian government or court sources, because those, like the Indian government says this, so why should we think otherwise, So I would urge that we really do that and really make our work more evidence based. So I'll stop there again in case there's some questions or clarifications. Otherwise, I'll just move into the third part of my presentation, which is really about the challenges of representing this issue in the media. And it's a short 3-slide PPT. But I'll just stop for a bit in case anybody wanted to come in or you wanted to say something vis-a-vis the first segment and you didn't have the time. So happy to hear from you all.
Yeah. Are there any questions or any reflections, anything that you want to share? Maybe any myths or misconceptions that you had, or something that you've unlearned over time, or you still might find difficult to unlearn, whatever it is. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I can add. So I was sort of thinking about the messaging bit from a little bit of my experience. So we had in our work, we were doing a little bit of training with the Anganwadi workers and that setup. And it's mostly that if we were supposed to train them regarding sexual reproductive health and to say that, pass it on to the community in which you're sort of working with to the women that come to the center, it would mostly be attributed to like a religion sort of thing. This particular religion is likely to not have abortion services. This religion would be okay with it. This caste would be okay with this not. So I was just wondering that in that messaging or through like I was thinking of ways in which how do I communicate this to that to the Anganwadi workers in general, like sort of looking at from a social sort of myth thing. Yeah.
And I think it's a very complex issue. Huh? And I think part of the challenge is also, it's so hard to get data on abortion in general because it is so stigmatized. Gathering data is, and certainly we know this, and this is not just true to abortion data, but generally getting that kind of disaggregated data is hard. So one is not having any evidence to work with on this in the sense of data and facts, but it can also be a slippery slope, right? But for sure, there are these myths that are perpetuated about certain communities and certain castes, and all of that. Yeah, I don't know if I have any easy answers, and particularly in today's political context, it is even harder. I mean, you're seeing it play out in so many ways, right? So if you know a bit about, again, this government is introducing these population control bills, even though way back when we said we would not. So they're introducing these policies at the state level, which are about ensuring that families have only 2 children. It's called the two-child norm. Way back when we were trying to control the population, these were all these regressive ways of forcing people to have fewer children, because it was all about, if you don't control the population, you can't develop as a country. Of course, all that has been debunked over the years, but it's making a comeback. So, for example, just a few months back, the UP government announced this draft population control bill, and it was all this regressive standard setting on enforcing a two-child norm, and it was very clear from the language of the bill which community was being targeted. Right, so it's perpetuating a certain trope around this community, who tend to have more than one marriage, who tend to have more than one children, who are not supportive of their women's control over their sexuality or anti-abortion. And so, for sure, and you will see it play out. I mean, of course, it was already there, and now it's getting even further perpetuated because the government is actively feeding that narrative. And so that's one. Two, certainly for government frontline workers, I don't even know what sort of target setting and all is done. And there is. And you'll see the interesting ways it plays out. I mean, if you go back to the last census, which was done, because we haven't yet got the new one, when the census came out, and one of the ways the census also kind of categorized, by religion, and of course, inevitably, once even though if you are a Hindu, I mean, obviously that Hindus are still the majority, but obviously there was an increase in certain other communities, particularly Muslims. I mean, you know, and then you have all these demographers who tend to kind of then perpetuate this idea of this community not are anti-contraception, anti this, therefore this rapid, exponential explosion of population. Of course, they're also marrying more than one time, as if, and that's adding to this population growth. So certainly there's that narrative out there, and in our wider society, and you will see it play out, of course, at the community level. So yeah, I mean, I think there's very urgent and important work to be done. I think what we've always said when those kinds of narratives come out is actually where you're seeing higher population growth or you're seeing a certain kind of pattern, often it is because of poverty and lack of access to services. So, Muslims in this country, scheduled castes and tribal tribes have some of the worst, like human development indicators because of poverty and marginalization and exclusion. It's nothing to do with religious beliefs, because even in Hinduism, it's considered a sin. So, we don't even want to go down that road. What is our religious, whatever that might seem like a saying. So I think, yeah, and it's a complex issue. I wonder how one does the work in this extremely polarized, politicized domain, but for sure in smaller, safer groups to really think through what strategies could be useful. Sorry, I don't have any answers, but right now the situation is so challenging that one wonders, where to go and make a dent. For sure, many of us, including YP, we really came together and actually opposed this two-child norm and really tried to expose this very pejorative and Islamophobic framing of this policy on the two-child norm. But the government today doesn't listen to any of us. Laws still go through whether we like it or not. So yeah, I'm looking at your question, Shohini. In case a person is experiencing trauma, emotion, yeah, yeah, this is very common, no? The kind of abuse and there's a lot of work happening around now, obstetric violence and violence in healthcare settings that women in particular face. And it's compounded, no? So if you're somebody from a certain caste, a certain religion, it's compounded, no? Yeah. I mean, I think generally we certainly need to work more on how to create a greater support system. Sometimes, the issue of abortion rights, I feel, because it's come out of this human rights tradition and this idea of the individual and individual rights. I think we have work to do in framing it within a collective rights framework. That it's not, of course, it's about an individual's bodily autonomy, but in our work, how can we look at it as a collective kind of rights that we need to enable? And therefore, that's when we then start thinking about what are the supporting structures, whether it's working with family members, friends, partners, like even simply at that level, or what could that look like? But right now, yes, because it is so stigmatized, often sought in secrecy, that most pregnant persons who are seeking an abortion are completely unsupported. And often they're getting it in, exactly these hidden, stigmatized settings with, providers not always being quite abusive about it. Because, there is just this thing about, oh, abortion is seen to be bad, and providers are part of that social cultural kind of thinking. So where so it's to be expected that that will happen. So again, I think if there was a way we could really move this conversation, of course, at one level on looking at this idea of how do you enhance an individual's rights, but in our work, how is it that we can move towards this idea of kind of a collective rights? Because human rights, for all its standard setting, we know there's been a failing, which is why I think you're seeing increasingly, particularly from the more structurally excluded kind of communities, this idea of justice-based frameworks emerging, right? Whether it's women of color in the US, there's a whole robust sort of a reproductive justice movement, a disability justice movement, which are really looking at these intersectional issues of oppression, really looking at not just choice and rights, which is what human rights does, but looking at what does access really need to. Because you can have all the choice and rights in the world, right? Even today, if you look at India's abortion law, it's fair to say it's fairly open-ended to allow most people to seek an abortion. But do we have access? Do we have access in the way we would like to have it? Of course not. So I think we really need to think through very critically, like what is this rights-based framework which we need to advocate for, but how do you then move it in the direction of, we use the term intersectionality a lot, but it's really about this kind of taking into account what would it mean to really get meaningful access. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any other question, or Rupsa, do you want to?
I'll just quickly move on to the
Mhm.
final bit, which is this. I did a PPT on a little literature to kind of share this. So really, it's partly by thinking, but also just drawing from other kind of research. One is this thing of, as you know, often this idea that we must present a neutral view on the issue, as in must take opinions of both sides. Huh? And while in journalism that could be a good thing, I think on the issue of abortion, where you're kind of doing this kind of just juxtaposing of two kinds of, both sides kind of a framework, it can be really damaging, because the other side is really a bunch of people who are propagating myths and misconceptions and lies, basically, right? As I've tried to show in these other two things, trope of like children, unkilling an unborn child. So when you're seeking an opposing point of view, you're really, in a way, legitimizing some of these falsehoods to the readers. But definitely, I think because abortion is such a contentious issue, and media in general, which is very conservative, or people don't know enough, there's often pressure on people who are reporting on this to kind of be balanced, whatever that means. But there's been a different line of thinking in journalism and media, which is referred to as sort of this merit based line of inquiry, where really you don't have to go and take two viewpoints, subjective viewpoints, but really build your article on things like, complication statistics of, people who had unsafe abortions, speak to specialized, speak to doctors, etc., public health officials who are providing services, highlight like lack of access through data on health system, etc. So really, like, really, when you're reading a newspaper article in the future, if ever you come across one, and or if you can source some, really read that article, and then reflect on some of these ideas and see like which direction is that article, like how is it pitched. But for sure you'll find, no, a mix of both these approaches, the idea of neutrality representing both sides, and for sure you'll also find some which are based on this merit-based line. We're really not creating space for this oppositional viewpoint, which we know is damaging, which is based on lies, which is not evidence-based. I think also within media, for sure, it's really difficult to pitch stories, because often the people at the decision making level know very little, have their own internalized understanding, even might be opposing abortion access themselves. So, really finding the space within, in various kinds of online, offline spaces to cover this issue is hard. Um, Sometimes because it is so stigmatized, and that's one side of the story, and on the other side, often, like, let's say all of us who do the abortion rights advocacy, because we are so careful about always being speaking the same language, as they say, just because you don't want to kind of come up with differing ways on talking of about it, because you give more kind of, you, the opposition kind of pulls on that we tend to rely on similar kinds of points. So somebody, let's say a journalist who's trying to write on it, then really struggle to find new ways to present on it. They tend to end up getting the same kinds of points. Then the stories become predictable. And, news operates in a particular way. So, this thing of trying to build something that's unusual, etc. So that becomes an issue. Then you'll often find, I've had outreach from a lot of journalists who will call me and say, oh, can you connect me to somebody who's had an abortion? No clue about the stigma and the harassment and whatever. And exactly going back to this idea of presenting it as an individual rights violation versus a larger systemic one. But most journalists tend to adopt that because it's a person-centric story. But within abortion media coverage, is that person-centric approach useful, or is it actually more damaging? And not least because of the stigma and harassment. So really, one needs to be very careful about using first person accounts. There's also this tendency to dramatize things to make it newsworthy. Whether it's graphic images, whether it's kind of really using language that can be sensational. So for sure, commonly, feticide, etc., a bunch of these terms are very commonly used, partly about of not knowing, but partly about making it a hard-hitting story. Of course, people who cover it more progressively, I don't know how common it is in India, but in other parts of the world, certainly reporters who cover these issues face a lot of harassment. And then it's also very gendered, because mostly these are covered by women journalists, or persons who identify as women, so they tend to obviously face a kind of a gendered kind of harassment, and or they're seen to be, it's not seen as a hard investigative issue, even though the person might be doing really robust investigative, like evidence-based reporting. It's surely controversial, there's really high stakes, but it's seen as soft work, seen as something that's kind of, marginal, versus, let's say, some financial fraud, which will get the first page, or let's say the next 5 pages of a newspaper. So I think these are, of course, very recurring challenges that, people continue to face when they represent uh, on this issue. In India, you'll often, because of the whole coverage and the way sex selection has been written about, very commonly, there's this thing around aborting girls. Exactly what I was trying to reinforce is that, when they're trying to talk about an abortion that's sex selective, often the language, and particularly because in newspaper, trying to use more accessible language, non-academic language. In simplification, you end up using words that in fact end up doing more harm than good. And of course, I touched upon this idea of, even when it's a very progressive, positive article, the image can then create all the damage, where you're showing some pregnant belly of fetus, etc. Or this kind of graphic focus on late-term abortion, which is wrong. And I've touched upon this already, this idea of trying to highlight the issue through an individual story versus trying to create this understanding of it being a collective issue, and it's a systemic thing that we need to think about. And for sure, in media, across board, not just India, there's been a failure to really acknowledge the diversity and complexity of abortion experiences, and tends to end up being a very, very narrow way. So, post reading that article, it's either women who are seeking abortions because of sex selection, or it's about these young people, whatever, rape, violence, that kind of a thing, about the sexual, the survivor of sexual abuse or whatever, or it's married women. So very limited representation in media. Certainly in India, there's a fierce uh, resistance, continued fierce resistance, including from feminist and women's rights organizations, of moving beyond this women-centric language. One is the law itself. The MTP law is about women, right? Even in spite of our best advocacy efforts during this current amendment of really expanding the definition to include women and pregnant person, that was not done. So this law is really about women, but we are leaving out people. So I think there's a fierce resistance, and this idea, which is this, I feel, a false idea, that majority of people who need abortions are women, and they fought this battle and their need is the most, and therefore, like, why are we diluting this agenda to become more gender inclusive, inclusive of diverse people with sexual and being more inclusive of sexual and gender diversity. So it's still a very, very fierce debate and discussion, I think, which needs our attention. And it's playing out in other countries, as you all know, particularly, the whole transphobia. I mean, UK, US. I mean, so in India, it's not such an explicit conversation, but it's certainly there. And this idea that this minority of people who need it, why are you wasting your time? It's taking us away from our core issue of ensuring women's access to safe abortion. So I think that's something, again, we see play out within our work. And therefore, it's only obvious that media, which is not known to be the most nuanced and can handle a complex issue like abortion, you cannot expect representation in the way that we would like to see. So often, you will see it's about women. It is rarely referencing, other identities. So I think, yeah, I mean, I'll stop there, Pragya. There's been quite a lot of input. I hope you all found it helpful. Happy to hang around a bit longer to just hear from people. And I'll be sure to share both the toolkit and this PPT with you, Pragya, so you can pass it on to all the participants. But thanks for your patience in listening, and I hope you found it useful.
Thank you so much, Rupsa. I just want to say that I mean, every time I hear you speak, it's just really, really great, because I learn a lot. And I also have a few questions, but I just want to first probably ask the participants whether any of you have any questions or any reflections that you would want to share with us. I also want to make sure that that you all know that in case you don't want to share something here, or if you're uncomfortable sharing any particular details, you can definitely reach out to me or Shavik, and I can probably send that query, question, any sort of reflection that you want to share to Rupsa over email. So that is also very, very yeah, possible for us to do. But yeah, in case anyone else has any other questions. Yes, Akriti, yes.
So I was just thinking about, when you mentioned about the UP government going with this regressive form of family planning, I was just thinking, what approach do they follow when, a bench of stakeholders are sitting and making decisions? Do they apply the gender mainstreaming approach? Or what perspective do they apply? Or uh, I just wanted to have a better understanding, because I feel the bench of stakeholders who are taking the decisions also matter. Maybe they aren't gender diverse and inclusive in nature, and there's no balance in, like, there's one particular mindset who are taking decisions, and that affect the policy making. So just wanted to have a better understanding on that.
For sure. And I think it's part of the larger social engineering we are seeing play out, right? In so many different ways. If you look at the Citizenship Amendment Act, that's another version of the same, right? It's about a certain targeting of certain communities, of whatever pigeonholing. And for sure, a lot of our institutions, which should be autonomous and independent and guided by people who know some of these issues, whether it's demographers, others, um, uh, are not the people. It's very much a political act of creating this policy, and therefore it's biased, right? Because if one were to look at evidence, we are well into a fertility transition, including in Uttar Pradesh, across all communities. So there's absolutely no reason for a regressive law like this to come into place where you're penalizing people for having more than two children and denying them social benefits, access to all kinds of welfare schemes, denying the third child all kinds of other benefits. So one can see, and yet these are the communities, even communities where there are more than two children. It's often because child mortality is high, often because they don't have access to sexual and reproductive health services, often a bunch of other things, right? And so really, if you're going after a very criminal draconian approach that's based on incentives, disincentives, it's clear that that's not it's already been demonstrated through enough research and evidence. So to see it making a comeback in the way it has in these past years. So Assam has a similar legislation that I think passed already, and UP, I don't know where it's at, but the draft stage, I mean, certainly it was an active process. So, maybe they'll pass it just before the elections, etc. Who knows? But is makes it clear that it's a political project, that this is not about public health, this is not about human development, it's not about improving social indicators. So I mean, I just want to say that. So I think that's very clear, that's very clear. But I think you'll also find, because it's been such a discourse in India for the last decades, this idea of population explosion. We have a big population, because of the large population, that's why we can't develop, that's why we can't do this, it has to be this and then that development. So first, population is very deep rooted, and most common persons you talk to, they'll talk about this, you'll hear this a lot. Yet we know this, that the resources are really being monopolized, a very small percentage of population, not the poor people who are taking all our resources and or contributing. Like, you'll see this debate also play out very interestingly within the climate change conversation, environment and climate change conversation. Also, this idea of this, population explosion, therefore, which has also been debunked by now. I don't know if that answered your question. And yeah, I don't know who the committee was. I think it was the national sort of, I'm forgetting the body, but it's one of these so-called autonomous government institutions, like let's say the State Human Rights Commission. I'm forgetting the name of the body that drafted it. But now we know most of the people there are political appointees, not like you have experts who know the issue, etc., who are drafting this. So yeah, I don't know what the push and pull was.
Yeah. Are there any other questions or anything that any of you want to share? There's also go ahead with, maybe I can go ahead with my question. Yeah. So, Rupsat, I have one reflection and one question. One is might sound almost stupid, but I just want to ask that, say, in a country where, say, maternal mortality and like poverty and violence is such a central thing when it comes to any SRHR service and also abortion. Um, how then is narratives and thinking about terminologies also can become as important a discussion? Because, say, for example, I don't want to hierarchize what these two mean to different people, but I'm assuming that a lot of, say, people from marginalized communities might not be able to share this space where we are discussing about narratives, where we are discussing about terminologies, what to use, what to not use. So, how is this discussion important? And the second thing is that it's a reflection, and it's something that also makes me angry at times, is that very recently a lot of these post-pandemic, basically a lot of these anti-maskers, or say people who do not want to take vaccines, sort of have co-opted this feminist I don't know, feminist ethic of my body, my choice, and that also sort of makes me think about our narratives that we are building and how easy it is for, say, people from far right-wing groups to sort of co-opt it and use it as per their convenience. So it's also reflection, and also just like what happens to those sort of narratives. Yeah.
I think no, really important questions and reflections, Pragya. I think definitely, I think for sure, abortion rights advocacy. I think using the issue of maternal deaths and that as a way to open it up, like so, in other words, using a public health framing versus a rights based, it can be strategic and important. I definitely feel the discussion on maternal health, maternal mortality has neglected this issue of deaths due to unsafe abortion, but it is still averaging even in India in the best of situations. Overall average is I think now at 8%, but for sure we know in certain states it's much higher. So for sure strategically, and actually in India I think a lot of the a lot of the work on abortion has actually stayed on that side of public health, but has stayed at the side of this supply side. It's about facility, it's about quality of care, etc. I've always felt we've neglected demand. So really, what are women's experiences of accessing these services? There are these processes, like these maternal death audits. Abortion is deaths due to unsafe abortion are very hard to get them precisely for reason of stigma, but no attempt has been also made to figure out how. So how in these so-called maternal death audits can be also foreground. So it could be a very strategic way, so you're not going down that road of rights and autonomy and all, and really using that and using a public health rationale which nobody can dispute. Women are dying, and therefore, so I think that's a yes, could become a very important way. And I think frankly at a community level, that has to be a parallel strategy in even as we work thinking about issues of narrative language. How do you claim that rights-based kind of narrative on it, or at a minimum minimize the sort of kind of the pejorative, stigmatizing language that tends to get used. So can't be either or. And for sure, there's been a capture of our human rights language and mechanisms, partly because it's not just the non-state actors, but I think there's so many governments that are perpetuating it. No, I mean, you know, the countries around the world where it's authoritarian governments that are not interested in. I mean, even the Philippines was raised as an example, classic example. And these are people who are members within human rights bodies, let's say at a global level in the UN, who are shaping a certain kind of a narrative and discourse. So I think that's the other battle to be fought, is really how do we reclaim our language. I mean, for sure, this has exposed the limitations of human rights frameworks and languages, no? And which is why I think there's a growing emergence of this idea of a justice-based framework. Recognizing that this idea of this very much this individual-centric choice, rights has its limitations, will not get us where we need to get to. And that's clear, right? In these 50 years from the time of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to now. For sure, it's got us far. I'm not for a minute suggesting we've not made progress. Human rights standard setting matters. And certain kinds of mechanisms, it's important because it can hold governments accountable. But because governments sit within these bodies, whether it's the National Human Rights Commission or something, the government appointed bodies, it becomes limited. But I think, on the other hand, what we've seen is really social movements have really emerged therefore as this counter space to create new language, to look at things differently, and they're powerful movements that we can really look at to see how we can recalibrate the work we do on abortion. I think the abortion rights work, in my view, has remained a bit limited because it's been led by feminist and women's rights organizations who've not always been inclusive of other new social movements. Whether it's the LGBTIQ, and I'm using a homogenizing term, we recognize it's diverse, those movements, or the disability rights movement, or the sex worker rights movement. We have much to learn. And so I think another area of inquiry or engagement is really learning from or collaborating or building alliances with those movements, because I feel like the SRHR movement as a sub kind of a thing coming out primarily of a women's rights feminist movement historically, though it has become much more diverse, has in a way limited what we've been able to do. And that's where we're seeing a lot of the conflict playing out. Like this example I gave about being inclusive in our language, like it's still been argued as this women's rights issue versus, and there's a whole battle playing out around language, even in our advocacy. Forget about media and representation more broadly, even in our own work and advocacy. Let's say even when you're putting out a statement, there is a argument about, oh, should we put women's access to abortion versus pregnant person? Why should we put pregnant person? So at every level, I feel language does have a role, but I think we have to be strategic in piggybacking on some public health framing, some other framing, and finally really reaching out to other movements that have in a way embraced intersectionality, embraced like more diversity in a much more robust way than we have tended to do within the SRHR movement in the past. And we're beginning to see the shifts, but not as much as we would like to, for sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rupsa. Yeah, are there any other questions or any reflections? We're also sort of we've done some overtime today, and it's a Sunday evening, so I feel that I've kept you all here, including you, Rupsa. But yeah, if there are no more questions, then probably we can end the session here. I just also want to acknowledge Priya's work. YP especially is really inspired and always learns from the work that Priya has been doing. And I'll make sure to sort of share the toolkit and the presentation with all the participants. I will upload it on the portal also so that people can use it as a resource whenever they want it. But yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rupsa. I am so glad that that YP and Kriya have this relationship where we continuously learn from each other, and it's always been so enlightening. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for yeah. Is
Thanks.
there anything else? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you all for being here on a Sunday evening. I keep saying it because I really acknowledge your presence, and I am so glad that all of you were with us here. And yeah, I hope to see you all soon. We will have some workshops on advocacy around abortion, but and I'll keep you informed. But till then, just keep yourselves healthy, both physically and mentally. Also, Europe. And I hope to see you all again. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah, thanks, Ovik, for inviting me. Bye bye.